Hello, my name is Gary Davis. I am a Autodesk Technical Specialist with the Media and Entertainment Group. Today we're going to be taking a look at Autodesk Smoke and specifically focusing on tools that might be relevant if you're a 3D artist. My background is primarily in using 3ds Max and Mudbox and things like that. So what we're going to be doing is focusing specifically on the editorial and compositing functions and a lot of different tools that might augment a 3D pipeline in your production facility. Before we get started with the creative tool set, I wanted to talk a little bit about getting organized and actually just kind of managing media and bringing in media into the Smoke environment. Here you can see an empty area, and this is kind of home base, what we would call the desktop. And over here we have what are called source and record areas, or you might also think of these as bins. And these are set up obviously for my demonstration today. But right now we're just viewing an empty desktop right here and also an empty record timeline down here. So there's basically nothing going on yet. And then what we want to do is bring in media to start working on our desktop. So I'm going to go to this open dialog right here, and immediately you're faced with the Smoke library. Now the Smoke library is a way that what we call managed media, and these are assets that you can see that I've already brought into the system, and these are different render passes from 3ds Max. We'll be getting to a little bit about how to assemble these together, but I just wanted to focus a little bit on this library. So here you can see that I can expose lots of different directories and have access to all my different assets. And these can be QuickTime files, these can be image sequences, these can be OpenEXRs, JPEGs, Targas, stills, stuff shot on cameras, P2, Red Cam. This can be all kinds of different assets. And you can see we've got lots of different file formats supported in the Smoke environment. But right now what we're dealing with is what's called managed media in the library. Another way to work, if I go to a 2-up view here or a dual view, you can see that I have two different views. And what I can do is actually browse my network here. And this is going to be just browsing out to different volumes or different hard drives, whether they're directly attached to this Smoke system or they're elsewhere as shares within your facility. For example, here's just a Gary D USB drive, and this is just a drive that's connected to this Macintosh. And if I exit out, now I have access to browse that drive. So I have lots of different ways of bringing in assets to and from my system. So if I want to, say for example, take a look at these clips right here, you can see that I can view this in thumbnail view, and I can see different information about this. And I have a lot of options. If I say that this is an image sequence, how do I want to bring this in? What do I want my names to be? I can force a different frame rate if I want to, and do lots of different ways of bringing this in. Now we can work directly with this by bringing this onto the desktop by just loading this to desk, and I could do that like this. And so I have an asset brought in to the desktop. Or if I just go back to my library again, what I can do is browse out to the drive and move these assets, or rather copy them, and say store local copy. And I have options here to bring in just the RGB or the RGB and alpha channel as an alpha split. But what I could do is say, for example, let's up here look at our Smoke library, and let's just drag and drop this in, and I have the option to store local copy. So you can see that this says pending render, and that's going to be a background task. I can immediately start working with this asset, and I can also start scrubbing this, but in the background that's actually caching to the Smoke library as managed media, and it's uncompressed 444 media. So it's a great way to work if you have a local storage that's like a RAID array or something really, really fast. And I'll go back to a single view here and just kind of focus on our managed media. So this stuff here is all of our render assets that we've done out of 3ds Max. And I'll get to the specifics of what these are in a second. But I just wanted to stay focused on the library here for a second and show you a couple of more options. Now I'm using a Wacom tablet, and there's a lot of gestural type ways of accessing different tools within Smoke. And even out here on the library, as a 3D artist, a lot of times you have to load up like a RAM player or a flipbook player to actually see what your clips are, at the end of a render or in the morning or whatever. But what I can do is just swipe over here to the right with a very quick gesture, and I can actually just play these things through and see, immediately quick playback on this. So it's a full real-time playback, and I also can see a lot of metadata, like what is the resolution of this clip, what is the frame rate, if there's an audio track, and so on. But I can immediately go to these and just play these through. So the fact that we have this direct attached storage And these aren't any special drives. In this particular case, they're SAS drives. They're striped together as a RAID 0. So we're getting a nice throughput on our frames. But I have really nice access. And even before that I've done editorial or creative tasks within Smoke, I have really nice access to kind of browse through and have review of what my assets are that I'm going to be dealing with. So I could select one or more clips and actually just whether or not I choose to store local copy is a decision to be made actually prior to bringing it into the library. This case, they're already in the library, so I can just say load these to the desktop, and I have immediate access to these clips. And I can go ahead and just Control Escape and actually get to a full player and actually see these things through and loop these for an immediate review and just kind of the first thing on a Monday morning to take a look at all my render passes. I have a second source area up here just called miscellaneous, and I intentionally kind of made a mess of this to show you a way that I like to work with the desktop. One of the things that I do that's unlike any other editing system I've ever seen is use the desktop area. And, normally other applications have bins where you kind of throw things together, and you can obviously name your bins and get organized that way. But even using multiple bins is one thing, or I should say multiple source areas in Smoke vernacular. But one of the things I like to do is just organize things on the desktop. So I could say maybe I want to have all my live action plates that are going to be up here for my backgrounds. These are some elements that I already rendered out and have some compositing done to them. Here's 3 shots that we might start thinking about editorially, so I might start just wanting to put those down there. And looking at these two is kind of going to tie these 2 shots together. So just using very quick gestural desktop tools, or just gestures rather, to take a look at how you can organize your media. Another interesting thing is I can just hold down the Alt key and kind of hover over these clips and see, for example, that one's 1920 by 1080, 23.9 frames per second. If I go over this clip here, it's a 1600 by 1200 still image, and you can just get a lot of useful metadata information just by kind of hovering over things. Some other things that you can do before we really get into compositing and editing is to just start thinking editorially. Like for this clip right here, for example, maybe I don't want to have her boots in the beginning of this shot, so we want to start this shot sort of right in here, and I'm just scrubbing over this icon. And what I could do is just set a mark in point using my hotkeys, very much like an editor would, and maybe I want to stop this just before the camera stopped rolling. So I could come over here and just say mark out, and with a Shift F copy, what I'm doing is making a copy of that asset, but I could just gesturally throw this one away because I'm done with it, and now all I'm left with is just the in and out points of that particular clip. So you can start to, trim things down and really associate what you want to have your shots be prior to even using them editorially. A couple of other things that you can do on the desktop. Let's say I took these 2 clips and selected them, so I'm working with them both together. I have a whole source area set of tools right here, and I could just say, let's gang these 2 together. And what gang is going to do is actually treat these as one sort of, not as one clip, but you can see that I can sort of scrub time and actually watch these side by side. And I could do this with 2 or more clips, as many as I want. So I could just ungang these and kind of get back to working just gesturally. A couple of other things that I could do to kind of clean this up is maybe just select all. You can see that I've got kind of a mess here. It's an organized mess. That's the way that I like to work. But I could just say select all. I have every thumbnail in my the current desktop selected, and I could just say to maybe cascade these to get organized that way. And they're not locked into cascade, but it's just sort of an intro way to start getting organized. Or once again, I could say select all and maybe just tile these, and it's going to be a nice clean layout, and you can see that all the icons were resized to a proxy height that I defined right here. So it's just a lot of different ways, apples and oranges ways of getting organized and working with your source area before you start working in a compositing or an editing environment. The assets from Arc Media were created in 3ds Max, and I used a particular look that I like, doing non-photorealism for cartoon. Here you can see that in Max we've got 4 viewports set up, and these are 4 animated cameras. I'm not going to really turn this into a 3ds Max tutorial, but I did just want to show you kind of the basic setup of how we had our 4 cameras. And just as an aside, I will point out that I am running 3ds Max on the same Macintosh platform that I'm running. I'm using Parallels as an option. You can use Boot Camp to run Windows applications on the Macintosh. I'm just running Parallels so that I do have access to my Macintosh OS. But back to the action in 3ds Max, we've got our 4 cameras set up, And the way that I rendered this out was using a relatively newer feature called state sets. And there's other examples of how to use state sets and how to set these up on the Area website. But here what we basically did was we had our 4 cameras, camera A, B, C, and D, each set up as a state set. And each of those state sets is going to render out using what's called render elements. So for 3ds Max people, this is probably pretty familiar. For other applications, other 3D artists, you know, these could be called render passes or render layers or many other different types of things. But this is where you're going to split out things like Z-depth, the background, diffuse, and in this case I was using an ink and paint shader and things like lighting, reflection, refraction, and so on. We'll also take a look at the material ID in Smoke, but you get the idea that we're rendering out lots of different cameras and different passes. And I could go out using any number of different file formats, including PNG or multi-channel OpenEXR. So that's basically how this was set up inside of 3ds Max. And again, just as an aside, we were doing this under Parallels, running 3ds Max in Windows 7 64-bit on the Mac OS X. So here you can see we have a source area, and this is our render passes out of 3ds Max. Once again, I'd like to thank our friends across the pond over at Arc Media. This was originally a design visualization project, but I kind of engineered it to have more of a cartoon, sort of sci-fi cartoon look. And once again, you can see here's our render passes of camera A, B, C, and D, all rendered out of Max. And these were rendered using the Mental Ray rendering engine, using network rendering and Backburner. Pretty straightforward workflow for production out of Max. But then once again, we have our beauty passes, and here you can see we have things like our ambient occlusion pass, which is a very common workflow for rendering out separate passes. Here you can see we have an alpha channel of our scene, and this is basically anywhere there's white is polygonal geometry from our 3ds Max render, and the black is sort of the nothingness, or the, in this case, the sky or the environment where there wouldn't be any polygonal geometry. These crazy things over here we like to call disco mats. That's not an actual term in 3ds Max, but you can see where the terminology comes from. This is actually an object ID, or it could be a material ID. In this case, it was an object ID out of 3ds Max. And we're going to use these in a little bit more of an unconventional way inside of Smoke in a moment. A more traditional way of rendering out a mat would be this black and white pass. And here you can see we rendered out a pass that's specifically just to isolate the ice. So you can see on all these different clips right here, we have our cameras A, B, C, and D going across with our beauties and ambient occlusion and matte passes and so on. So what we're going to do to get started here is that I can just start gesturally editing down here. I'll get to this guy in a second. This is sort of my pre-baked cake over here, if you will, for the cooking show, and I'll get to that in a second, sort of our end result. But to show you how I built that up, we've got this record timeline down here, and I'm just going to F-copy this down in and just start gesturally editing. Excuse me. So I have our camera A. I'm going to grab camera B, and you'll just see my cursor sort of hover over, and it changes to that red icon. So what I'm doing is creating sort of a thumbnail view, and I can work again very gesturally and just start to see that timeline. So what we've got is our 4 clips down here, and I can view this in a number of ways. If I hit F3, it's going to be a collapsed view. And once we've got a collapsed view, or any type of view, in fact, if I have F3 or if I switch to F5, it's going to be more of a traditional layout, and you can see camera A, B, C, and D, and I can scrub our timeline. Up in the right corner, you'll notice that I have a record, what's called a record monitor, and that's an option that you can turn on or off in the preferences. I kind of like that because it gives me the ability to see what I'm working on while at the desktop level. But if I want to see this more of in a traditional editing workflow, I can just gesturally swipe my cursor, whether it be a mouse or a Wacom pen, over to the right, and now you can see that I'm actually more in sort of a traditional nonlinear editing environment. So now I can think in terms of nonlinear editing. We have our shots A, B, C, and D, and we can do things like, you know, navigating our timeline and getting back to sort of home base in terms of working editorially. So whether or not you were the 3D artist that generated this clip, one of the things you might look at is that, you know, we had all these, you know, cool shots that we thought camera A, B, C, and D, but we weren't really thinking in terms of story. And if we look at these shots, you know, camera A shows quite a bit about what's going on in this scene, that it's sort of an Antarctic, you know, space pod kind of thing. B is pretty mysterious. You can't really tell what's going on in there, so we might want to have that up in the beginning as sort of a reveal. And then this the camera C is almost like our great, you know, ending, where we can really see the whole base camp, if you will, of this Antarctic. So if we look at the last one, this shot D, this is maybe the most mysterious of all these. So what I want to do is start telling a story with these. And we had, you know, out of 3D, you know, we did a bunch of cool shots, but you might be thinking more shot-based as a 3D artist, or even if as a 3D artist with just a compositor, you're typically working maybe on one shot at a time. Here we can think in terms of storytelling, so we might want to say, let's use our positioner, and this is the yellow vertical bar that I've been moving around, and I actually have the ability to snap to a lot of different things using traditional nonlinear editing tools in Smoke. I particularly like Snap Positioner, and the other two hotkeys that I'm going to introduce is just Z and X, and what that's going to do is pop me between each of these transitions. So with Snap Positioner on, what that allows me to do is say, let's get to that ending shot of our, you know, really mysterious sort of, you know, what the heck am I looking at here, and let's put that all the way in the beginning. So I'm going to snap my positioner all the way into the beginning, and then just gesturally just drag and drop this D clip and put it in the beginning. So now we have D, A, B, and C. So let's take a look at that again, thinking in terms of editing. So we've got our shots there. Well, I might want to put this camera B as another one of those sort of mysterious, not really sure what I'm looking at shots. So let's just snap our positioner to this point, and let's gesturally, once again, just drag and drop that. And now we're starting to tell a story where we've got these sort of mysterious reveal shots in the beginning, and then toward the ending of our 4 clips, we're really kind of showing what's going on. So we've started to tell a story as an editor, and now what we could do is think and switch our brain back into compositing mode and start taking advantage of all of our render passes. So to do that, I can just think in terms of layering up these clips just as you would in other applications like Photoshop or, you know, layer-based workflows. So I have a timeline here, and I can very easily just tap this layer button, and I get a whole new area up here to start working with our other render passes. And once again, I'm going to take advantage of this Snap Positioner and take a mental note that this is D, B, AC, and I want to be very careful with that, obviously. But what we're going to start to do is composite our ambient occlusion. So we have the clip D first, so this is the first clip. And what I'm going to do is actually tap the G key to just insert this, and I get that ambient occlusion D comped right over our base footage or our beauty pass. Next up, and you can see our positioner went to the end of that, so it's kind of waiting for that next clip of our B ambient occlusion, which is right here. Once again, I'll tap the G key. I need our AO for A, and then lastly C, A, B, C. So now we've got our timeline where we're starting to see our ambient occlusion in there, and they're in the correct order, but obviously we need to start using transfer modes or blending modes for these. So what I'm going to do is take a look at this first one, and I'll introduce a concept called soft effects. This clip right here, what I'm going to do is turn on this axis soft effect, and what a soft effect actually does is quite a number of things. You could do like position, and you can see that there's one layer you know, underneath another. I'm going to undo that. That's positioning and rotation and scale isn't really what I'm after. In this case, all I'm after is our blending mode, and I want to just take our ambient occlusion and multiply that over. And you can see that we now have the result of our ambient occlusion multiplied over. Another thing that a concept that I can introduce you to is this little horizontal yellow bar right there, which is called the focus. And I can use my arrow keys to kind of pop that focus, and you'll notice it going up and down as I just hit the up and down arrow on the keyboard. And that's showing us sort of a before and after of that composited ambient occlusion. So you can see that we've got our, you know, ambient occlusion happening in there. And then what I can do is I want this axis effect with our multiply transfer mode copied to these other 3. So I could just shift copy that, and then what I'm going to do, and you can see that these soft effects are actually numbered 1 through 8, and these are all effects that you can do, you know, no plugins required. These are all effects that can be applied to every single clip in your timeline. So what I'm going to do is select all 3 of these, and you can see that little number there. I'm going to hold Control 1 and just copy that soft effect from the first clip to the other 3. And now we've got our ambient occlusion comped over all 3 of those. So we've thought about editing, and now we're thinking about compositing, and you can see that we've got that coming through, you know, quite nicely. You might notice as I scrub the timeline that there's actually our sky has kind of disappeared, and the reason for that is that our ambient occlusion pass is being comped over, and we do in fact have our blending mode, but there's another effect that we can take advantage of in our Axis soft effect, and that's using a matte. So we rendered out, remember, our alpha channel for our entire scene. So basically all four of these ambient occlusion passes need this matte applied, and I can very easily do that by using this soft effect called Axis. So with this first clip selected, just D, I can say I need a matte of D, which is right there. And once again, very easily just do, I need a matte of B, A, B, and camera A, matte A, and C needs its matte A, B, C. So now as I look at this timeline, you can see that we do in fact have our ambient occlusion, but we also have our sky that's revealed. So we're really starting to take advantage of multiple render passes in our timeline, you know, once again, editorial and compositing in one environment. So to do some more selective effects here, we've got this matte over here that we rendered out for the ice. What I could do is in our timeline, I'm going to send our focus, this horizontal positioner right here. I'm sorry, the positioner is the vertical. This small horizontal little cursor there, I can just drop that down, and now I'll get a little tricky. I want to have our ambient occlusion on the very top, but what I'm going to do is have the focus right here and then add another layer, and you can see that I inserted a layer between these. So it's not just a matter of saying layer 1, then layer 2, then layer 3. I'm actually inserting sort of a second layer underneath our ambient occlusion. And then what I could do is maybe do like a selective effect, and I'm going to only do this once. You'll get the idea on all four of these clips. Let me just find one. Let's do it on our last clip over here. So I could set this positioner and just snap to our clip right there, set our focus, and then what I need is another copy of C, and I want to do a selective effect. So it's basically doing something that you've seen me do. I'm just doing it a little bit of a different way, is that I'm going to take a copy of itself, and then this second clip I want to do a color correction on. Now if I do a color correction on this, and I can do that as a soft effect, here's our color corrector, and I could really just, I'll just show you this, let's maybe desaturate this. Oh, and our matte is actually inverted, so I can come through and let's go into our Axis effect for this. Let's get our matte of our ice, and we're on shot C, A, B, C. So there's our clip, and now when we go back to our color corrector, you can see that I could maybe like desat this and change our intensity of our ice and really kind of fine-tune that color correction. And once again, I can use our focus to kind of pop between. There's our base layer, there's our color corrected ice layer, and there's with ambient occlusion on top of it. So you can see that we're really starting to do our compositing in the timeline. The last effect I'm going to do on this is, you remember these disco passes that we have that are kind of funky. One of the things that you can do out of 3ds Max is render a material ID or an object ID. And again, these are kind of funky looking passes here, but if I go A, B, C for our C clip here and just take a look at this, let's say for example that the director wanted to do something and like color correct these windows, but the 3D artist didn't render out a matte for it. Well, these ones are kind of a catch-all, a nice grab bag that you can render out, and maybe you can try to anticipate what you might want a matte for, but you don't have to render out an individual matte. So there's a lot of different sort of mattes inside of one of these disco mattes. And to show you that, I'll just use this C clip. So once again, A, B, C. And now what I'm going to do is actually take advantage of a what's called a desktop tool. And here I'm going to use a keyer. I'm going to be showing chroma keying in a second here on another clip that we'll be working on in a moment. But I'm going to use a chroma keyer in a little bit of a different way here. Ultimately what we're after, when you think about a chroma keyer, we're really just generating an alpha channel. And taking away a green screen and making an alpha channel for typically like an actor on a green screen. But here we can use a keyer, and I'm going to go in and just say, let's key this clip, and I want to have the result back out on our desktop. Now there's a lot of tools in these keyers, and there's a lot of different modes to this keyer that we'll get to in a second. But for this one, I'm just going to use a standard RGB keyer, and I'm just going to isolate that window. And if I use the hotkey F3 to take a look at the matte, you can see that we've actually generated a nice matte for this. And I can just process this back out, and it actually takes less than a second. And if I go back to the desktop, you can see that I have a nice matte that I generated from our disco matte. And I could go back in and use any number of keyers on this to generate as many mats as I want for this. So I could go back in, F1, look at our front, and say maybe I want all this crazy purple to be another mat. So I could key that out, maybe check that in our looking at our mat view. And then let's just once again render that out. It takes about 2 seconds to render that out, and on our desktop we now have another mat. So that's where these material IDs can be really useful for doing things like selective color correction, and they're kind of a nice catch-all way out of 3ds Max or other applications that can do these sort of disco mat passes. To close out this section, I'm going to actually once again think in terms of kind of compositing and editing. And on this last shot, if you really look at it, we've got our nice color corrected ice with our ambient occlusion and all that good stuff. But this shot actually ends sort of down low, and it begins up high with this nice last final reveal. So one concept that I'll introduce, we've got all these comped up the way that we like. All of our render passes and selective color corrections and our mats are being used nice. But what we might want to do is actually reverse this clip. And I want to do that effect to all of these. Now I do have a soft effect called time warp over here. But what I'm going to first do before I time warp it, instead of doing 3 time warps, what I could actually do is just select all 3 of these clips and come over here and do what's called a container. And this you could actually think of in other applications, might call this a nested composite. But what we've got is a contained version of all 3 of those clips. So now they're kind of acting like one, and you can really still see that they're it's the result. We've got our dark colored ice and our ambient occlusion on there, but it's acting more like one clip. And once again, I can select that clip and do a soft effect. And in this case, what I'm going to do is enable a soft effect called time warp, and very simply just say, let's reverse this clip. But by doing so, it actually reversed the entire shot with all of those composited layers. So what we've got now is this last shot that kind of starts low, and our camera comes up and does our final reveal. So that's a nice ending on our timeline compositing. What I'm going to do now is take a look at some tools, a couple of more tools that are available on the desktop. We saw a keyer a moment ago, and I'm going to now focus on some desktop tools that are also very important or very valuable to the 3D artist. Earlier you saw me use the keyer module at the desktop level on those disco mats, but I want to point out that there's a lot of different tools here available, and these are all in different categories. For example, right now I'm in a category of tools called video, and here you can do things simple resize or repros and do interlace or re-interlace. There's actually one that I use a lot for doing color source, of sending out SMPTE bars of a different resolution or a frame rate and things like that. But the one that I'm going to first talk about here is in a category of tool called flame effects. And this is one called damage. And I'm actually going to just take that finished timeline that we did earlier and just bring it out onto the desktop so I can take advantage of these desktop tools. And I'm just going to go bring that into our damage node. And here you can see that we've got all these different film effects like blotches, color, dust, grains, scratches, and so on. And also projection defects like defocus, flicker, hairs, and jitter. But what's great about this is there's also a lot of presets here. And I could say, like, let's look at an old archive and just see what that looks like. And this is, very dramatic effect. And if I just play this through, even without rendering, you can see that it's got jumpy film effects. There's even scratches and hair and all kinds of crazy stuff going on in there. So these are just some presets that we can use. As this one looks like almost like a faux JPEG compression effects. The one that I'm after for this particular example is one that is called security camera, and it's going to make it quite literally look like a security camera. But then what I can also do is just bring back, turn off my auto key or animate button over there, and what I'm going to do is bring back some of the color. So here you can see I'm bringing back, it's almost been fully desaturated as the default setting of this, and I want to bring some of that setting back. And then what I can do is just either just kind of see this, make sure one last check on this, go back to my first frame and process this back out to the desktop. So you can see here in less than 10 seconds we're processing out over 200 frames of HD footage. And that result is going to be back out onto the desktop that we can use, again, back into our timeline, or we could export this as, different file formats and so on. The next tool I'd like to show is also in the category called Flame Effects, and this one is for doing depth of field. This depth of field tool actually is asking me for a front and a Z depth, and you've probably seen doing depth of field in compositing applications before, but what's nice about this one is this thing down here called the depthogram, among other things. And the way that I like to work with this is actually just crank up the blur way too much, so I'm going to get this cranked out blur effect that I know is going to be too much. But what I can do is use the Z plot tool over here and actually just drag this around on my model. Now as I do this, I'll point your attention down into the depthogram down there, and there's a gray vertical bar that's moving around representing the depth in my image. So what I could do is say maybe I want to focus our first frame attention on this gun barrel right here, and the resulting depth is plotted right here. So what I can do is just drag this along, and you can see that as I move this depthogram up and down my model, that I can see that depth according to what's in focus, and this yellow line is what's in focus. I can also animate this by turning on the auto key, and the red and the blue line are basically my fall off effect for that, which I could also animate accordingly. So the way that I like to work with this is to go to maybe my last frame, and what I can do is once again I'll use the Z plot to pick this character's face, and it's way down there on the end, so I could just drag this all the way down so that we have our focus effect of our character, and you can see that we've got a nice blurry effect on our gun barrel right here. And then what I like to do is just kind of do first, last, and split the difference. So maybe I'll go somewhere into the middle of the animation here. Once again, I'll do a Z plot and try to find something that is an area of interest. And I'm noticing that right here in our depthogram. And I can really just fine tune and not only affect where the focal point is, but also the range of depth of field. So it's almost like I'm animating a rack focus and the f-stop of a camera, as a post-process, and not having to do that as part of my 3D render. And then ultimately, when I get this the way that I like, I just simply turn off the auto key and dial back down the amount of blur to something that's a little more pleasing to the eye. Another category of tools at the desktop level is for stereoscopic work, and this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Autodesk Smoke has the ability to work with stereoscopic footage, whether it's CG rendered as it is in this case, or whether it's live action shot with multiple cameras. Here all I'm going to do is just create a stereo track, and it's prompting me select the left eye with the red arrow and a right eye with the blue arrow. So here you can see my naming conventions for left and right eye, and then what I can do is just leave this out onto the desktop. And what I can do with that clip is actually create a new timeline, and if I look at this in a more traditional editing approach, you can see that this does in fact have our left and right eyes sort of slaved together, and you can see that that effect is actually visible right away in our viewer. So under the viewer there's a lot of different options. If I leave this on our stereo options, I have the ability to look at this with our difference, and this is basically the difference between the left and the right eye. I also can view this in a monoscopic or a Dubois stereoscopic anaglyph, and this could be where you put on your red and blue glasses and actually take a look at this, and you're really able to adjust these things and kind of see things in full stereo because this is a full stereoscopic tool set. One other thing that you can do here, if I work on the axis effect for this, under my surface I can actually switch to stereo and change the convergence of this. So what I'm doing right now often can cause headaches to people, but this is the ability to go in after the fact and maybe fine-tune your stereoscopic effect. So this is going to be another example where the desktop tools are quite advantageous to the 3D artist working in a stereoscopic pipeline. One more tool at the desktop level that might be very familiar to some people is this blend and comp node. This is actually a node that's very similar, or it's identical actually, to Autodesk Composite, which used to be called Toxic. Some people still might be familiar with that name. But Autodesk Composite ships with 3ds Max and also Maya. And what it's asking for here, you can work with a bunch of different ways of working. I'm going to go with front matte, and back. And this is basically just a 2-layer comp, and each layer has a matte pass. So what I can do up here is just say I want our foreground ambient occlusion with a matte, our background with a matte, and then the background of the entire clip, and I'm going to send that back to the desktop. And if you look at this, you can see that we have the exact same blend and comp tool that's found in Autodesk Composite, but here you can do things like our color corrections built into our foreground layer. I have all of our frame blending modes, and I can change that between Photoshop or Flame. And here you can see that I'm choosing between several different blending modes, and in the case of ambient occlusion I would in fact want to multiply. So this is going to be a basic 2-layer comp that you could do and then process that back out to the desktop as an option. Just another way of working. So we've seen timeline-based compositing. We're going to be taking a look at a full 3D compositing environment next. But this is just a note at the desktop level. If you know you just need to do a quick comp of two elements, especially render passes that are meant to work exactly over top of each other and don't need to translate, two layers don't need to move around. All I need to do is just sort of render these out. So I go back out to our desktop and we get our finished result. So we can play that out. To introduce 3D compositing, I'm going to actually show the end result here, and this is just a very short shot, and you can see that we have an actress that's been heavily treated to kind of match our cartoon look that we've been developing. Once again, I'm just a big fan of that kind of look, so we're matching our CG back plates with chroma key actors. So if I get back out to the desktop, before I move on, I would like to really thank our friends at Full Sail University in Orlando for letting us use their chroma key stage. This is my good friend Ken LaRue on set, and there's our talent Ginger, and there's little old me with my Canon camera. So this was just a DSLR shoot that we did, and lots of different, having some good fun that day, and just taking advantage of Full Sail's green screen. So we'd like to thank them. There's my good buddy Chris Murray, who was kind of the spearheading the whole day and wrangling everybody. So it was just some good fun on their chroma key set. We'd like to thank them for providing these assets. So what I'm going to do down here is we've got our editorial timeline, and this has already been decided, that we've got our shots set up. And let's actually move this one out of the way. That was sort of our pre-cooked thing, and here's our finished. I can actually just kind of, I'll leave those around. But let's say that this wasn't on the desktop. What I could do is actually, I'm going to be using this backplate, and I'm going to be creating this kind of look, and I know I'm going to be using this shot right here. So if you look at our first shot, we've got our talent Ginger on green screen, but what we don't have is it on the desktop. Well, just by selecting that clip, what I can do is match that out using a hotkey so that I get our clip extracted out on the desktop. And then another desktop tool that's extremely powerful that I want to introduce is a tool called Action. So this tool right here is our full-blown 3D compositing environment. Now I can go into that a number of different ways, and in this case I want to go in kind of with a clean slate, so to speak. So I'm going to say clear all, and I just want to go in with our talent and then take the result back to the desktop. So it's loading in our clips, and you can see here that we've got, it might be hard to see on the capture software, but we've got our 1280 by 720p frame outline there, and then our talent of our clip was actually shot 1920 by 1080. So what we could initially do right now is actually just go and just scale this down a little bit, and you notice that the background is actually not scaling. It's kind of a little bit misleading there. What I'm going to do is actually turn the background off, so we're only looking at our clip, and then immediately I'm just going to start to do a quick key on this. I'm going to come in and use the master keyer, and like I showed you before, there's a lot of different keyers in here: an RGB keyer, YUV, HLS, channel keyer, RGB, CMYL, or even a luminance keyer. In this case, I'm just going to use the master keyer and very quickly just sort of swipe through my color and across the talent. And if I look at our matte for this, you can see that we've got a little bit of fringing in our alpha, and this is probably due to a highly compressed SLR format. In this case, it's going to be fine though, because we're going for that sort of stylized look. So I'm just going to crush down my blacks a little bit so I have a true black alpha channel in this. And then if we look at our result and maybe just erode this a little bit, that's going to be pretty good. So let's return back out, and now what I'm looking at is our keyed result, and now I'm going to go back to the desktop to get our background. So I'm going to say new media, and I'm going to get our background and load that back in. Now this background doesn't need an alpha channel, so I'm going to turn its matte off. So you can see that we're starting to composite things up. However, the way that this is working is actually in our 3D space, so I can start pushing this back in 3D space. And one other thing that I'm going to do is actually turn on my Z sort, so it actually knows sort of the priority of our layers in 3D space. And then what I can do is actually just switch into an orbit tool to just show you that we are in fact working in a 3D compositing environment, although at this point we're just using 2D elements. So we'll be building up this this particular shot with just 2D elements, and this background was rendered as just a still Targa or TIFF file. I can't remember which I did, but it's just a still image file that was done out of 3ds Max. So what I'm going to do is switch up to a 2-up view here and start looking at a schematic view. And this should be very familiar to anybody coming from 3D. And I'm just going to set up my viewports here a little bit so that I can see what's going on, in my full view and also in my schematic view over here. Now, just to remind you, we are working with 2D layers in a 3D space, but something that I can do is actually, you know what, and I'm actually going to go to 3 views to make this a little bit easier to see. Go to 3 views, and I'm going to have this top view. So once again, you can see I can move around my camera just like you're in a 3D application, because we are in a 3D compositing environment of action. But what I'm going to do, so this is a top-down view, and I'm going to take my back plate here and switch this from being just a flat card to what's called a bicubic. And by switching to a bicubic, it allows me to actually select some control points on this and just pull these back. So you can see as I manipulate this around, I'm actually creating a curved surface. And if I look at that in my camera view and kind of orbit around, you can see that that background plate is actually not flat anymore. It is truly a curved surface. So as I let me just rearrange my viewports here a little bit so you can really see what's going on. Now our back plate is kind of a little bit far back. This axis effect you could think of as a null helper, or a lot of different 3D animation softwares call that different thing. This is just a placeholder, if you will, for each layer in space. So this axis effect right here is got position, rotation, and scale information for our talent. So we'll just put that back right in frame there. And this one right here we could actually position maybe closer to the camera, and let's just scale that up so we can fill our frame right there. So we're just making sure that we have a full frame of our backplate. To finish out this shot, I'm going to go to what's called the node bin, and here you can see a lot of different tools that we can introduce into our schematic. And this is actually all of the the full nodes, but we also have subsets, and these are things like objects, and we'll be elaborating on these in a moment. Surface, maps, which is more like texture maps, and what I want to get to is this lighting tool. So if I just drag and drop a light out into my scene, or into my schematic view, you can see that I do in fact have 3D lighting in my scene, and you can see that in the top view. I can manipulate that very much like I would in a 3D program, because once again we are in a 3D environment. And if I just double click on that light, I can get attributes about this particular light. So I can control the color of this light and maybe do things like start introducing some whether I want to work in RGB or hue saturation and so on. So maybe I'll just get this sort of a blue tint, or maybe I don't know, a green tint. Maybe that's a little bit too saturated, so I might just desat that a little bit. So we get our light effect somewhere in there. And then one other thing that we could do with our light selected, we could come through and say we want to have actually a shadow casting light. So if I just enable shadow casting, my light is actually really close to her right now. So let's take our the light itself and maybe go to the object and sort of position this back in space. And then what I'm going to do is actually change the shadow type from 2.5D to actually full 3D soft shadows. And I can control the softness of that. And you can see we have shadow maps very much like in 3ds Max or other applications. We've got a resolution of our shadows that we can control depending on the output resolution that we're doing, and just to control that fuzziness. At 512 by 512, I do get that sort of jagged edge, but because I'm using 3D soft shadows, I can just soften that up and actually get a really nice soft edge, even with a relatively low resolution shadow map of 512 by 512. And that shadow right now is a little bit harsh in my opinion, so I could just soften that, or rather not soften it, but just reduce that effect and kind of drop the transparency back of that shadow. So we get this nice looking image, so far so good. And what I'm going to do now is actually go back to the first frame of this clip, and I'm going to process this effect back out to the desktop. But instead of just processing it, this time what I'm going to do is actually hold this button down and say process and create history. So now it's going to render this clip out, and it's going to take all of about 9 or 10 seconds to render out. So we're getting our clip out, and what this is doing is, instead of just processing out and baking all these effects in, it's making it so that there's a history associated with this clip. So once it's rendered through, and now we've got our, I can exit back out to the desktop, you'll notice that this clip that was rendered out actually has this little H icon right there. And what that allows me to do is double click, and I can go back into and see quite literally the history of this clip. So that's a way to work non-destructively with these desktop tools. And once again, I can look at this in collapse view or our edit timeline and so on. And the last one to sort of just finish out our look here is just another fun effect in a category called Flame Effects 2. I'm going to go into our Stylize desktop tool and just pick our rendered clip. And with this one, I'll actually reset it. That's our end result from last time. And look at the front view. Whoops, reset. What I can do is actually pick all these preset looks. And I've got all these different presets for a cartoon. And you can see that there's quite literally just dozens and dozens of, there's chalk outline and just, a whole slew of these different ones. I'm going to pick cartoon, the very first one, and then just show you that this is actually built up of lots of different effects. But what I could do is maybe add one more effect, and this particular one that I want is maybe sharp outlines. And I can still edit these and control things like the transparency of the lines, the threshold of the lines, maybe the thickness of how those lines are going to be looking. And you can see that I could, have endless looks on this. And once again, once I get this the way that I like, I could save that setup if I want to. And in this case, what I'm going to once again do is process this and create history. Now you'll remember that we processed the action setup with history, and we're also processing this sort of stylize effect with history. And now if I go back out to the desktop, we have multiple versions. So this was our original clip that we matched out of our timeline. This is the one that we did with our 3D compositing, and this is the one with the stylized look, and you can actually see that. And now as our last step, with this clip selected and our sort of result selected here, I can just match that in, or sorry, replace it with a hotkey K, and I'm going to drop that back into our timeline. So you can see that that clip is now part of our timeline, but it still has that history associated with it, and I can go in and double click and get back to our different effects. So I could, change these effects non-destructively as much as I want. A moment ago we saw 3D compositing in Smoke's action environment, which is taking advantage of the bicubics and 3D space with things like lights. Here I am back in 3ds Max, and I'm actually going to prep some assets in a little bit of a different way, as opposed to rendering them out using things like the render elements and specular diffuse and getting image sequences out of 3ds Max. What I'm doing in this case is setting up a scene for exporting and bringing into Smoke's action module. I just wanted to show you a few things of how this scene was set up. Here we've got a light that's in our scene, and this is an Omni light. If I look at our hit list for the scene, there's actually a few things. I've got 2 cameras, 2 lights, and then a single entity called walls, which I'll explore in a second. But just to show you that I have 2 cameras in my scene, I'll kind of pop between the one. There's one camera sort of looking through this corner of this sci-fi hallway. And if I pop into our other camera, this is going to be our main camera that we're going to be using over in Smoke's action environment to take advantage of this 3D space. If I look at this 3D geometry, this is in fact one big model of this wall. And if I were to just kind of rotate it around a little bit, you can see that this is in fact one piece of geometry. And if I look at the material for this was actually set up using a newer type of material, a newer map type rather. If I just double click on this material type, if you're going to be using assets from 3ds Max over in Smoke or Flare or Flame, what you want to do is use a standard shader, and this is the old school standard shader that's been in Max since version 1. But what we're also doing is taking advantage of the newer substance maps, and these are called smart textures. These are supported in 3ds Max and Maya, as well as the Autodesk Smoke and Flame products. So what we're doing is setting up different channels, in this case diffuse and specular, and we're putting that map type inside of a standard shader for exporting. And then ultimately what we're going to do is just come up to our dialog here, and when we export this scene, we're going to use the Autodesk FBX file format. And if I were to just say test.fbx, a great feature about this export is that you do have a lot of different options, and FBX is what I like to call the glue between Autodesk applications. It's a way to export data between things like Softimage and Mudbox and Motion Builder and Max and Maya and so on. And you've got all these different parameters that you could use, and even if you're going into some other pipeline or a non-Autodesk product. But since I'm going from one Autodesk product to another, I've got this great little preset that just says current preset Autodesk Media and Entertainment. And all I have to do is make sure I'm using that preset, and all the attributes and the options for exporting this data over to Autodesk Smoke will be handled for me. And then all I have to do is ultimately export this out, and now that file, that FBX file, is ready to be used over in Smoke's action environment. Once again, I'm going to show you sort of the finished result of where we're headed here, and you can see once again we have our green screen actress, we've got some lighting effects and some shadow effects, and we've got our virtual set that was created over in 3ds Max. However, this time, instead of rendering out things like render passes with specular, diffuse, and ambient occlusion and all that good stuff, what we've done is we've exported that FBX model, and we're going to use that asset without any 3D rendering directly in our action environment within Autodesk Smoke. So to do that, once again, I'm going to go into action. This time I'm going to go in with a clean setup and just have a completely empty setup, and immediately I'm going to go to my two views here. Now the cooking show, a little bit of work that I did ahead of time, I'll show you real quick. It's nothing really that you haven't seen before. All I did was I have a axis effect with our actress that's been already keyed ahead of time, and to just show you that what I did, you know, we've got our actress, and if we look at our matte result, we've got, you know, our green screen once again using the master keyer. We choked the blacks to get that really nice harsh, you know, pure black alpha channel. And then if we return back out to our action setup, you can see that we also have an axis effect that we've done. We've sort of positioned her in space, and we also rotated her 90 degrees because we shot this with our camera set on a 90-degree angle to get extra resolution for her height. So ahead of time, I really just positioned that in space. It really isn't anything that you haven't seen me do already in this webinar, but I just wanted to save myself some time on things that you've already seen. So to get to the good stuff here, what I can do is, once again, I'm going to go to this node bin and actually come under our object dialog here and select import. Now when I click and drag this out into my scene, what it's going to do is browse out and give me the option to get different file formats, including Photoshop, which would be layered two-dimensional images. That's not really what I'm after. I've got other legacy file formats like Wavefront OBJ or Autodesk Inventor. The .3ds format is also legacy file format that really works pretty well, but the FBX is the one that I would highly recommend. And I'm going to actually go out to a bookmark that I've created for my project and go ahead and load in that FBX. Now this is going to take a second, but just to remind you, what's happening is that we're bringing in not only just, you know, well, we're not bringing in pixel information, we're bringing in full 3D geometry with shaders. We've got multiple cameras, we've got multiple lights, and you can see that in addition to just the pre-baked layer of our actress, we've got a whole lot of other stuff going on in here. Let me just zoom out a little bit so you can see what's going on. So what we've got here is an axis effect, and as I break this down, let me zoom in so you can kind of see this a little bit better here. This axis effect, and let me just separate this out, you can see that even our naming conventions are coming over from 3ds Max via the FBX. We've got our walls object and its actual physical polygonal geometry. It has a material shader, that's the standard shader coming over from Max. That has an axis effect that controls the tiling on our image. And the image that we're using is that substance engine that ultimately is our sci-fi texture. So all of this represents, this whole chain of nodes right here represents our 3D scene. And if I just go out into our viewport and sort of orbit around, you can see that it is truly a virtual set that is our, you know, polygon geometry. This is not a rendered 2D card like we were doing earlier in action. We're still taking advantage of 3D space, but in this case we're actually using non-rendered assets and actually sending over you know, saving ourselves all that render time and sending over 3D textured geometry. So in addition, we've got our cameras, and you can see that here we've got camera 1 and camera 2. If I go down to my setup here, what I'm going to do is, or the output rather, is show you that we do have in fact our camera 1 and camera 2 if we needed those. I can also go through here and turn on our shading. So for this entire scene, what I'm going to do is turn on shading, and you'll see that the lighting in our scene is actually, you know, really starting to affect it. Also interesting to note that the lights came over with shadows. So before you saw me manually add a light and manually add a shadow to that light using the action setup in the node bin, and I can still do that. I could add additional lights to this scene. But note that these lights with their naming conventions, the colors, and the position in 3D space actually came over you know, from 3ds Max. So what I can do here is just start to wiggle this around a little bit and actually see where that light is, and you can see the shadows there. Once again, I'm going to change to 3D soft shadows. I'm a big fan of those. They just give you that nice true soft shadow. And you can see that I can in fact move this around in 3D space and get that soft shadow effect. Now this light is a little bit too close to her, and as I move it out, you're going to see it start to illuminate her. So I could just sort of reposition this, you know, my 3D guy, or if I was the 3D guy, I might have set that up as best I thought in 3D space, but it might not be perfect for this comp. So we can just sort of position this around and get that to a nice, you know, position in space. And then this backlight right here, once again, we can kind of manipulate this around and sort of focus in on that light that's way behind her. Now this particular light, what I'm going to do is start to add some effects to this. And I'm going to go back to the node bin under our relighting tools, and I'm going to add a lens flare. Now with the light selected and adding a lens flare, a lot of you may be, you know, kind of scoffing and laughing at the old lens flare effect. But what's interesting about these lens flares is that they're full 3D lens flares. So this is going to take a second. What it's going to do is load in multiple raster images, and these images are actually, they come with Autodesk Smoke, but you can load in your own if you want to. So here's this light, and once again we have our shadow casting on it, but what we just added is this flare with all of these raster images, and you can see that if I manipulate the light around in 3D space and it goes behind her, the actual lens flare effect is occluding in true 3D space. So it's a full-blown 3D lens flare. It's not just a raster, you know, bitmap sort of effect that's happening in 2D like on a card. This is a full 3D lens flare. I can also do things selectively, like the streak. Here's this anamorphic streak that's sort of very transformerish, if you will. And if I just tap the H key to sort of hide that effect, and I'll do this on and off a few times, and I'll point your attention over to the viewport, you can see that that streak is coming on and off. And likewise, I can do any number of these effects and sort of turn them on and off. Here's this real flare effect from the lens right here, and I could just sort of hide that if I want to, or I could dial those down, or I could replace those images if I want. And this is just one lens flare. There's tons, you know, hundreds or, you know, dozens and dozens of presets that come with this, and you can obviously make your own for an unlimited number of effects with this flare. Another thing that I'm going to do on this light right here is actually go back to our node bin under lighting and add rays. So if I add rays to this, you can see this little sort of laser beam coming out of here, and if I just double click on our rays to get to those attributes of the ray object, I can adjust the intensity of that. So I'm going to leave that intensity pretty high, and I'm going to adjust the spread of this to sort of make this like a sort of almost like a nightclub lighting effect, where it's just a nice big beam of light. And then I can do things like position and rotation on this ray effect. So I can just, you know, manipulate this in real time, no 3D rendering required, and I can really just get that lighting effect to be exactly where I want for this particular scene. And again, it occludes, she's occluding that lens effect. So as I put this light maybe right behind her, you can see the rays coming around, and as she were to sort of jump down and land on the ground, as I scrub forward in time, you're going to see that she, you know, reveals that lens effect because she ducks behind it. So we've kind of got that backlighting set up. Let me just lower the intensity of that light just a little bit so I can darken that down a little bit. And then our other light right here I'm going to use as more of a color correction effect and kind of maybe warm up, or sorry, cool down our sort of whole scene here, and maybe just reduce the intensity of that a little bit. So we're getting our look. Again, we're bringing in all this information from our 3ds Max scene without doing any rendering. And then what I could ultimately do is, when I like the look of this, and remember we're going to treat this with that same effect, I can process this back to the desktop, and it's going to take all of about 20 seconds. And to just kind of reiterate what we've done, we brought in 3D geometry, we brought in two lights, positioned them in 3D space automatically using our 3D application. Those lights are also shadow casting, and we have the ability to sort of continue to edit those, like color and soft shadows and things like that. Also adding these fantastic 3D lens flares and sort of a volumetric ray effect. So once we get this rendered back out and back out to the desktop, what we could do is just match that back into our timeline, and again start thinking back in terms of editorial finishing. So we've got our couple of clips here, and then our last one is actually one that we just did ahead of time. This was done on an actual set, so this was not a virtual set. This was a backlot at Full Sail University. But you can see that this clip is actually, remember that this is 1920 by 1080 HD clip, and we're working in a 720p comp. So one last little effect I'm going to do is remind you that we have these axis effects, and we've talked about those a little bit earlier. This time I'm going to go into the axis editor, and what you've really got, and you can think of this axis, I sort of saved this till the end, is you can think of the axis tool as almost like a one layer action space. So we've got our 3D comps, and I can do things, a lot of what we were doing with our lighting effects and so on, but I could just use this almost as a repro tool in this case and get back out to the desktop. So now I've got all three of these clips done. We've got our treatment, you know, with our sort of our cartoon look across all of this. And then one last effect that I'm going to sort of introduce you to is a thing called gap effects. Now remember, these over here are called soft effects, and what we were doing before is applying these to any number of our, or any one of our clips, and we can have any number of these applied to our clips. But what I can do similar to before is add a layer, but this whole layer right here is just empty. It's actually not real footage, but what I can do is apply those soft effects, and this is what's called a gap effect. So what I could do is almost do look development across my entire nonlinear edit and do something like, in this case, maybe let's just go in and do an axis effect, and in this case all I'm going to do is just enable one light, turn on shading and enable the light. I'll just mess with the fall off a little bit, and I've only got a few attributes in here, and that's all I really need. I'm going to move the light toward maybe out a little bit. Let's change the spread of this light down, and what I'm after right now is this sort of vignette effect that's, you know, pretty popular, and I can just sort of ignore the light right in my face right now, but I'm really just looking at the corners of the screens for that sort of vignette effect. And now if I exit back out without doing any rendering, I can see that I've got that vignette effect across all three of my clips. And once again, I can use the focus to sort of see a before and after of that. And then lastly, what I can do is just select all my layers in the entire timeline and just process this down. And we've got all of those effects happening and processing, you know, almost about 130 frames processing in, you know, 10 or 15 seconds. So that's a lot to take in. I know this has been Gary Davis. I appreciate your time, and I do want to thank you for taking a look at this. Stick around. We've got one last little bit of information if you're interested in finding out more about Autodesk Smoke. To find out more information about Autodesk Smoke, visit autodesk.com/smoke4mac. There you'll find lots of product information, product videos, and a link to download the 30-day trial. This is a great way to try out the software for yourself. You'll also find there an independent study by Pfeiffer that analyzes the benefits of using Smoke over a multi-product workflow. Inside you'll find benefits for specific finishing tasks that show the productivity advantages of Autodesk Smoke. There are also tons of resources available at area.autodesk.com/smoke. There's a link to the free trial download and access to Smoke website. You can also read the latest news, check out the blogs, tutorials, forums, and connect with other users on the area community. And I would really encourage you to check out Grant Kay's blog that's specific to Autodesk Smoke. If you're a student or faculty member, you can download a 36-month license of Smoke for Mac OS X from the Autodesk Smoke Education Community site. Just log on to autodesk.com/smoke-edu to download the software, access free learning and support, and share your work with a community of over 1 million members. Well, that's going to do it for me. I really want to thank you for your time today, and definitely check out those URLs, and I hope this opened up your eyes if you're a 3D artist looking for a solution that's compositing and nonlinear editing in one. It's really a great finishing solution, and I highly encourage you to check out Autodesk Smoke. Thanks.